Ever think about how each generation seems to get its own, unique challenges and opportunities? We're always hearing about millennials, Gen Z, and now even Gen Alpha. But what if we looked at these generational divides through the lens of, well, space?
Space.
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating approach because it implicitly links technological advancement with how each generation sees its place in the universe.
Okay, so unpack that a bit.
Well, think about it. We've gone from mapping the Earth to landing on the moon to sending robots to Mars.
And now, with Gen Alpha on the horizon, this source is suggesting they're reaching for Alpha Centauri, the nearest star system to our own,
Wow.
which is a pretty big leap, even metaphorically speaking.
Yeah, for sure.
But I have to admit, I'm hooked by this whole cosmological inheritance idea. What exactly does that mean?
It's the idea that each generation inherits a set of assumptions about what's possible based on the technological advancements of the time. It shapes their worldview, their goals, even their fears.
Okay.
Like you mentioned Alpha Centauri, for a generation that grows up with space travel becoming more and more common, that kind of ambition isn't science fiction.
It's just the next logical step.
Right.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. So how does this source actually define each generation?
Well, it's not the typical...
Because they're not using the typical born between these years kind of thing, right?
Exactly. They start with millennials being described as discovering the planet.
Which at first glance sounds a little simplistic, don't you think?
How so?
Like we've always been on this planet.
Of course,
Yeah.
of course. But remember, this is all metaphorical.
Right.
The source seems to be drawing a parallel to a time before the internet, before instant global communication.
Ah, okay. So it's about millennials witnessing that shift firsthand, the world becoming truly interconnected during their lifetime.
That you remember life before smartphones and social media, that explosion of information and connectivity, that's a huge part of what shaped the millennial experience.
Yeah.
It was like the planet suddenly became a lot smaller.
Totally. I remember thinking email was the coolest thing ever, and then suddenly, boom, social media. It really did feel like discovering a whole new dimension of the world. So if that's millennials discovering the planet, what's the big takeaway here? What does that say about their cosmological inheritance?
I think it highlights their front row seat to an era of incredibly rapid technological change, which instilled a sense of possibility, but also a burden of figuring out how to navigate this new hyper-connected world.
Okay, so millennials were all about discovering the planet as this interconnected global village. But what about the generation that grew up with all of that already in place? Where does Gen Z fit into this cosmic picture?
Well, the source describes Gen Z as living in the solar system, which I find incredibly evocative. It suggests a generation that's not just aware of Earth's place in the cosmos, but sees themselves as active participants in a much larger story.
That makes sense. I mean, Gen Z has never known a world without the internet, without smartphones, without these constant reminders that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And for this generation, space exploration isn't just something they read about in textbooks. It's becoming increasingly commonplace. They're growing up with private companies launching rockets, with plans to colonize Mars being discussed seriously.
It's like their backyard has expanded to include the entire solar system.
Right.
But there's also this interesting tension, isn't there? Because Gen Z is inheriting some pretty major global problems at the same time. Climate change, economic inequality, political polarization. These aren't just abstract concepts for them, they're lived realities.
Absolutely. And that's where this whole idea of cosmological inheritance takes on a new layer of complexity. It's not just about inheriting a sense of possibility. It's also about inheriting the responsibility to address these increasingly urgent problems. In fact, the source even goes so far as to say that Gen Z might leave behind unsolvable problems for the generation coming after them.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy thought. So they're living in the solar system, but they might also be stuck cleaning up the messes of previous generations. What does that say about their relationship to technology? Because on the one hand, it's brought about amazing advancements, but on the other hand, it's also contributed to some of these unsolvable issues.
That's a key question, isn't it? Gen Z has this incredibly powerful toolkit at their disposal, but they're also grappling with the unintended consequences of past innovations. It's like they've been handed this incredibly powerful spaceship, but the fuel gauge is blinking red, and no one's quite sure how to fix it. It creates a fascinating paradox.
And to make things even more interesting, we haven't even talked about Gen Alpha yet. The source barely mentions them, but when they do, it's in the context of reaching for Alpha Centauri. I mean, we're talking about going beyond our own solar system. What does that even look like?
Well, for one thing, it suggests a level of technological ambition that dwarfs even what we're seeing today. Remember that mention of replacing silicon with diamond?
Yeah, that caught my eye. Sounds pretty out there even for a deep dive like this.
It does, doesn't it? But it speaks to the potential for exponential leaps in computing power. We're talking about processors that are thousands of times faster and more efficient than anything we have today.
So we're not just talking about bigger rockets, we're talking about completely revolutionizing the way we even think about technology.
Precisely. And if Gen Alpha is being framed as the Alpha Centauri generation, it suggests a future where the boundaries of what's possible are constantly being redefined.
Oh, yeah.
It's both incredibly exciting and a little daunting, don't you think?
Definitely daunting,
Yeah.
especially considering what you said earlier about Gen Z potentially leaving behind unsolvable problems. It makes you wonder what kind of world Gen Alpha will inherit.
And what kind of cosmological inheritance they'll carry with them. Will they be able to learn from the mistakes of previous generations, or will they be forced to confront the same challenges on an even larger scale?
It's almost like each generation gets handed this cosmic toolbox, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
But the blueprints they inherit, the successes and the failures of those who came before, those really shape how they use those tools.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole reaching for Alpha Centauri metaphor so powerful. It represents this incredible potential, this drive to explore the unknown, but it also acknowledges the immense challenges that come with pushing those boundaries. And it seems like this source is suggesting that Gen Alpha, while inheriting this amazing technological legacy, might also inherit the responsibility of solving the problems that previous generations couldn't or wouldn't.
It makes you wonder, what does it look like to reach for the stars, to strive for something as ambitious as interstellar travel, when you're also carrying the weight of those unresolved issues? Because we're not just talking about spaceships and technology, right? It's about tackling social injustice, figuring out sustainable ways of living, grappling with the ethical dilemmas of artificial intelligence. It's about building a future that's not just technologically advanced, but also just equitable.
Absolutely. And that's where this source, even though it's just these fragmented thoughts, really gets you thinking. It's not offering easy answers, it's raising questions about the kind of future we're building and the legacy we're leaving behind.
It's both exciting and a little terrifying, isn't it? The possibilities are endless, but so are the potential pitfalls.
It is, and it really highlights the interconnectedness of these generational experiences. Remember how the source described Gen Z as living in the solar system? Well, that implies a sense of perspective, of understanding that we're all in this together on this one planet hurtling through space.
Right. And if Gen Alpha truly represents this leap beyond our solar system, this move toward a future where interstellar travel is possible, then their cosmological inheritance is going to be shaped by everything that came before.
Exactly. They're going to inherit the knowledge, the innovations, the mistakes, and the unresolved problems of all the generations that came before them. It's a lot to carry.
It really is. It's like they're being handed the keys to the most advanced spaceship ever built, but the instruction manual is missing a few crucial pages, and the fuel gauge is flashing red, and will you get the picture?
A very vivid picture. But maybe that's the point. Maybe each generation's journey isn't about finding all the answers, but about asking the right questions, pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and hopefully leaving the universe a little better than they found it.
And on that note, I think we've reached our own metaphorical Alpha Centauri for this deep dive. We've explored this fascinating concept of generational shifts through the lens of cosmic exploration, and we've uncovered some pretty thought-provoking questions along the way.
We have, and I think it highlights just how interconnected these generational experiences really are.
Absolutely. So here's one last thought for you to ponder. If Gen Alpha really does represent this leap beyond our solar system, beyond the familiar, what responsibility do we have right here, right now, to equip them for that journey? What stories will we tell them? What tools will we leave behind? And maybe, most importantly, what kind of ancestors do we want to be?